So this is what we're going to be looking at in today's session. We're aiming to finish at 4 o'clock, which I'm aware is a little bit later than was originally advertised. So thank you for those of you who can stay until 4, but if you do need to leave earlier, as I say, the session's being recorded, so that's absolutely fine. We have a break scheduled for around 3 o'clock because it is, you know, a bit of a longer session than the previous ones. But please feel free to step away at any point if you need to. And also, as we go through, also please feel free to ask questions or make comments, and you can use the chat function if you'd rather not speak out loud, or you can just put your hand up. I will be relying on Sarah and Stephen to pick up on those because I won't necessarily see them, but we will try and get to any questions that you have as we go through. So as you can see from the outline, we're going to be looking at the sort of principles and practice of audience development, what it is, how a plan can help you, looking at things from the audience point of view, and some planning tools that can help you develop your audience strategy. And then we'll have a very brief look at what we'll be looking at in the next session for those of you who are able to come along to that one. And there's also some links to additional sources and resources that you might find useful also in this slide set. And the slide set will be shared with you along with the recording after this session. So just to kick off the introductions, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Audience Agency, we're a national audience development agency, and we also work internationally as well. And our primary role is in supporting organisations to use insight and data to inform their audience development and to help them develop meaningful relationships with their different types of audiences that they may have. As you now know, my name is Jackie and I'm part of the consultancy team at the Audience Agency. And I work very closely with my friends and colleagues in the research department and also in the Audience Finder support team as well. And those are things that we will look at in some of the other sessions that are coming up as part of this programme of audience development sessions. So that's a very quick introduction to us. There's lots more information on our website if you want to find out more about us. But I'm really interested in getting to know you. I do recognise some of you from the EAPR session, so it's nice to see you again. But what I'd quite like you to do now is if we can just go round everybody, and if you could just tell us your name and the name of the museum that you're representing, what your role is there, and also when you see this object, what's the first thing that springs to mind? So if we can just briefly do that as we go round. I don't know, Sarah, do you want to pick on a volunteer to go first?
Right, well, the first person that's on my screen is Keziah. Have I said that right?
Yeah, you have. Well done. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Keziah. I'm from the town in Eastbourne, and I'm the marketing and communications assistant there, but I'm interested in developing that role as one that takes audience development into consideration. And I guess looking at the image, or the object, it looks like a tapestry. It makes me think of kind of like home and nostalgia.
Thank you, perfect. Do you want to pick on the next person, Keziah?
I'm not sure, let me see. Jason is the next person on my list.
It's live. Hello, sorry, there's two of us here actually. There's Rob, our curator, and me, I'm the director. So we're at the Museum of Military Medicine, and the reason I wanted to look at this today is that we don't actually do a great deal of audience development work at the moment, but it's something that we do need to start looking at quite seriously. So that's why we've signed up to this. And as regards to tapestry, well, Mary Ann Boddy was obviously very young when she did that, and would love to know really what became of her, what the rest of her life was like.
Lovely, thank you, Jason. Do you want to pick the next person?
I nominate Phil Williams.
Hi, I'm Phil Williams from Tame Museum. Going back to when I first looked at the tapestry, first thing that struck me was a medieval garden. That's first impressions.
Excellent, thank you.
Oh, next person. I can't remember who we've had now. Laura Williams.
Sorry, it took me a while to turn my mic back on. So yeah, I'm Laura Williams. I work at the Novium Museum in Chichester, and I'm the Communications and Events Officer there. Yeah, the tapestry, it's quite childlike, like sweet, innocent, childlike. And yeah, the word nostalgia. So I can't remember the name of person who said that earlier. That sort of struck me as well.
Thank you, Laura.
Okay.
Would you like to name the next person?
Again, I can't remember who we've had and who we haven't. Charlotte Griffiths, have we had?
Hello, I'm Charlotte. I work at Discover Bucks Museum in Aylesbury. So my first impression was like, oh my goodness, a huge amount of work. And I can't imagine any child that age nowadays doing that, sitting still and doing all of that. I think it's amazing. That's me. And can I
Cool, thank you.
so I picked Joe. Joe for it.
Just to let you know, Joe's microphone isn't working, so you may have to pick somebody else.
Okay, Hannah Grigson.
Hi, yeah, so I'm with the Army Flying Museum and I work with Joe. Yeah, I guess looking at the tapestry, it reminds me of the Bayard tapestry and, you know, that long tradition, but also of some work that we've had done with our outreach sessions, making banners and things for the museum, you know, using embroidery and stuff. So yeah, I think that's it really. So I will nominate who have we not had? Miranda is at Eden Valley Museum.
Miranda, your mic is still muted. I don't think she's heard us, is she? You're
Oh, it's muted.
brilliant. That's it. Sorry, we didn't catch that, Miranda. So if you want to start again.
Okay, I'll start again. I just had a look at the wording and I thought that the wording appeals to me because it's children don't really speak like that to their parents anymore, you know, to be sort of to learn to be obedient and to learn. It's just sort of quite nice to read it, and I can see the date at the bottom, 1789. I think it's a really lovely thing a mother might cherish, actually.
Lovely. Thank you, Miranda. Do you want to pick somebody else?
I don't know anybody here, so I don't know whether I can see everyone on my screen. I'm not sure.
You've got two options. I think it's Catherine or Becky
There's
now.
Hannah.
I think. We've done Hannah.
We've done Hannah. I'm just going to pick a name. Catherine Webb.
Hello, so I'm Catherine Webber, obviously, and I am the Head of Learning at the New Forest Heritage Centre in Lyndhurst, and I'm here really because I'm looking to see how Audience Develop this work could actually inform our learning and education programme. The first thing I thought of when I looked at the object was very personal, because I thought embroidery, and I thought of my aunt who does a lot of embroidery, but then I was also surprised at the date on it, which was much earlier than I had expected. And I think it's just Becky left now.
Yeah, hi, I'm Becky. I'm from the Powell-Cotter Museum in Thanet. I am the museum officer here. And my first initial thoughts were, how old was the child to make such a beautiful thing? Because it's lovely, and kids nowadays probably wouldn't make something like that for their parents. It'd probably be like a colouring or something virtual. So it's quite nice, and it's nice to have that symbolism of history. That obviously it's from 1789, so it's quite a long time ago. So yeah.
Lovely, thank you so much, and thank you for sharing all your thoughts on that particular object. It's something that we'll come back to and reflect on some of the similarities and differences in your responses to it, and we're going to sort of look at that from an audience perspective a bit later in the session. But moving on now to start thinking about what audience development is. Before I start looking at some more formal definitions of what that means, would anyone like to share what audience development means to you? Any thoughts on what that might involve or encompass, or even what the term audience means to you?
I start?
Yes, please. Thanks, Phil.
Basically, finding new people, or having people find you for the first time, and basically just making the place more well known, and also making sure you are best suited to your audience, to the people.
Fantastic. Yes, lots in there. That's a lovely definition. Thank you. Any other thoughts?
Hello, so it's Catherine speaking. Is it also how we can increase our relationship with those audiences, for example, encouraging them how to come back or return to us, and also looking at how we engage with them, putting it very crudely, on-site or outreach, you know, the different ways that might take place, and providing access or engaging with audiences who wouldn't normally engage with our museum or collections.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, involves all of that as well. And actually, I think between the two of you, you've quite neatly captured all of those different dimensions, really, about what audience development means. So it's largely thought of as a process of increase or change for the better. And that can be about, you know, increasing footfall, so the number of people that you're engaging with, or the types of audience that you're engaging with, so introducing new audiences. And also, as Catherine was saying, deepening your relationships with some of your existing audiences. So it exists in all those different dimensions, but it's also, as Phil was saying, it's about inviting people to do something at its heart, really. That's what audience development is. And in your audience development plan, you're likely to involve all of those different aspects of development in consideration of different types of audience and your strategic priorities for the development. There's lots of different formal definitions of audience development. The audience agency, we define it as a planned organisation-wide approach to extending the range and nature of relationships with the public by focusing on their needs. And the Arts Councils and the National Lottery Heritage Fund also have their own definitions, but they're all very similar. They use slightly different language, but at their heart, they have a common thread of putting audiences at the heart of a planned decision-making process, which operates across the whole organisation. And for me, that's one of the key things about audience development, that it's not simply the role of the marketing team or the outreach team or, you know, any individuals within the organisation. It's something that everybody contributes to, so it should be a shared process that everybody understands, and understands what their role is in helping you as a museum develop those audiences. And I think it's also worth just pointing out that there is a difference between audience development and community engagement, for example, and they're often, community engagement often comes into an audience development plan, but those communities exist regardless of your organisation. Audience development is a way of thinking about your relationship with them. So community engagement is likely to be an important part of your plans for developing that audience, but it's likely to be part of a much broader strategy. And I think it's sometimes those phrases are used interchangeably, and I think it's useful to, to sort of understand that there is a slight difference between them. And as I was saying, audience development can take place in lots of different dimensions. So deepening your relationship with your existing visitors. So as Catherine was saying, getting them to do more, to visit more frequently, or to do different things with you. So for example, they might engage with your permanent offer and visit your museum galleries, but they might not be attending events, for example. So sort of understanding how you might get them to do more and different things with you as an organisation. And there's also potential for cultivating those existing audiences as potential donors or supporters, advocates, volunteers. So getting them more involved with you as an organisation. But you might also be looking at a broader reach. So inviting more of the same sorts of people and increasing your footfall. So you already know that your offer appeals to them because you already have some of those people in your audience, but you have the potential to bring more of them in. And that can help with some of your other strategic priorities. Or it might be finding entirely new audiences. So much like Phil was saying, building your engagement with different types of visitor. And your planning is likely to include all of those different things at different stages of your development. And I think a useful way of thinking about it is that many organisations, all organisations, I think really, are in a position of balancing different priorities. So the sort of triple bottom line that most organisations are looking at are your financial priorities. So, keeping the lights on and the doors open. And I think post-COVID, that is particularly relevant because a lot of museums have, seen a huge shortfall in their finances. Also your social responsibility priorities. So there may be particular community groups, for example, who are underrepresented in your audience profile, in your visitors, that because of your purpose as a museum, it's important for you to reach out to and engage them in some way and build a meaningful relationship with them. And you also, you're likely to have curatorial ambitions. So, different ways of presenting your collections, for example, or developing your collecting policy. So lots of different things going on there as well in your sort of professional development. And I think it's really useful to see how you can balance all of those things together by putting audiences at the heart of your strategic planning. So quite often those three things can be seen as competing with one another for, particularly for resources, including, time within the organisation, but also perhaps emphasis, which is the most important thing to concentrate on. But actually by having a strategic plan which addresses the needs of different audiences, you can address each of those priorities at the same time and have a really balanced approach to your overall development. And I think that's also key to strategic planning, is that your audience development shouldn't sit aside from your business planning and your other strategic planning, it should all be part of the same process, because that will help you actually deliver it successfully. And thinking about that process, it's important to think about it as a long-term investment. So you might have aims, for example, which are quite challenging and ambitious, but you can address them through a strategic plan and plan to deliver them over time. So I think, you know, it's very rare to have quick wins in audience development, particularly if you're looking to reach out to new audiences. Some things, you know, can happen more quickly, but it really is a long-term investment so that what you build is sustainable and becomes part of your business as usual. I think it's also important to see it as a sort of a living thing. It's not something that you set in stone and then you stick to it for the next 10 years. I think it's good to have aims which are more long term, because they will relate directly to your mission and your purpose. But within that, you know, year on year, you might, you know, change the focus of your development, for example. So it needs to be flexible. It needs to reflect changing needs, both for the organisation and for your audiences as well. And it's an ongoing process. So it's not a sort of start and finish thing. It's something that you go through as a cycle, and you're continuously reflecting on it and thinking about, you know, what's worked well, what hasn't worked well, what changes you can make. So it's this sort of ongoing iterative process of learning and really using evidence that you collect to inform that process going forward. And you can see the sort of the starting point really of that ongoing cycle is identifying your purpose. And this is often the hardest thing to do. Organizations can spend a great deal of time, you know, thinking about and talking about, you know, who they are and what their purpose is, coming up with mission statements and that sort of thing. Often because different people within an organization may have different perspectives, depending on their understanding of, you know, what the priorities are. Thinking back to that triple bottom line, you know, different people in different teams may, you know, have different strategic priorities and may not see the bigger picture. So again, it's really important that this is a cross-organization exercise in understanding, because once you have articulated your purpose and what you're all about, what it is that you want to achieve, it really underpins everything else. It's very empowering because it means that it really gives you sort of criteria for saying no to things, which I think is, you know, one of the most powerful things you can do. And it also makes sure that everything you're delivering is actually feeding into that process and helping you to achieve. It means that you're making, you know, the best possible use of the resources that you have, which, you know, nobody has enough time, and, you know, budgets are really stretched, particularly after the challenges of the last 18 months, 2 years that we've been going through during COVID. So I think, you know, being really clear about what it is that you want to achieve, then you can start to think about how you're going to get there. So just to summarize those basic principles of audience development, it's important to think about that it's not just about now, it's about thinking to the future. And it means that you're not doing things on a project by project basis. I think an easy sort of pattern of delivery to fall into, particularly if you're successful in getting external funding, for example, is to put a lot of time and effort into particular projects, which, you know, can deliver really impactful engagement with particular groups, for example. But if those groups were to come back in 12 months' time, there wouldn't be anything for them, because all of that was delivered as a one-off project with a very sort of clear outcome, but it wasn't embedded in the organisation day-to-day business. So an audience development plan means that that kind of development work that you do is sustainable and is built in, so it doesn't sort of fall into the sort of difficulty of perhaps being a little bit token, that you work really deeply with a group of people for a period of time, and then you move on to the next group of people. I think it's important to always consider that you're using the term audiences in its widest sense. I'm aware that for many museums, visitors is a much more commonly used word, but with audiences that can encompass, your visitors, people who participate in different activities, your different stakeholders as well, and they can be internal as well as external. Your plan should be mission-led, so reflecting on what it is that you want to achieve, that purpose that sits at the heart of everything, and it should be a shared approach across the organisation. It helps to balance those different priorities that you might have, and most importantly, I think it's based on evidence. So use all of the evidence and information about your current audiences and your potential audiences, which is where those area profile reports that Stephen was talking about can be really useful for identifying, who's in your area, who are your potential audiences, and how are they reflected in your current audience profile. And it addresses how to use different strategies to engage different types of audience, including both those existing and potential new audiences. And it's really about those long-term relationships, long-term development, that continuous process of reviewing and ensuring that you continue to be relevant. So, for example, organisations that had an audience development plan pre-COVID were in a much stronger position to respond to the challenges because they already had a plan in place, and it was just a case of pivoting it and delivering things slightly differently. Whereas for other organisations, it was much more difficult to respond and much more challenging. So, thinking about, what can a plan do for you? I think this quote from Terry Pratchett sums it up very well for me, because essentially in your planning, you have to start, once you've identified your purpose, the next step in the process is an analysis of where you are now, because if you don't know where you're starting from, then it's very hard to start to think about, where you want to be and how you're going to get there. And if you don't have that sort of overview of where you want to go, then it's very easy to go off track and not make best use of the resources that you have available, essentially. So in terms of thinking about where you're starting from, this is part of the informed development that sits behind your audience development plan. So using the data that you have to set benchmarks and identify who your target audiences might be. And there's lots of data that you probably have, and it's quite a useful exercise to go through is something like a data audit, where you identify all the data sets that you have, whether that's if you're conducting visitor surveys, or you have feedback forms, or you have reports from particular activities that you've done. You might have footfall figures, you might have a visitor book or something like that. And also you have an awful lot of information sitting in your teams. So your front of house teams, your visitor services, they can probably tell you quite a lot about who's visiting. So, you know, draw all of those things together and try to build a really clear idea of where it is you're starting from. And also thinking about, you know, where you've done some particular campaigns or messaging and marketing about your offer, which things seem to be generating the most interest. Use your digital analytics, make sure that they're set up in a way that gives you some useful information about how people are interacting if you have social media channels, for example, that you're using. And I think your digital engagement is, you know, should always be built into your audience development planning. It's become more important post-COVID, but I think it's, you know, it's always been important. There have been changes, and I think more and more now people are seeing digital engagement as an important thing in and of itself, rather than as a simply as a route to physical visiting, for example. So think about engagement through your social media and how people are using that, and how different audiences respond to different types of messaging and different channels. And then also think about your current programming and what's in the offer, who it appeals to, how you might develop it to meet the needs of different audiences. So, you know, a good starting point is to have a really thorough investigation of everything that you already know, and then identify what the gaps are. So what is it that you need to know that you don't have information on, and think about how you're going to gather that. And that data collection and data use is something that we will look at in future sessions in more detail, but it's a really good starting point to gather together all of that evidence that you have, to start thinking about, you know, what the opportunities are for developing those audiences. So really thinking about where you want to be. So going back to those different dimensions and different ways of developing your audience, you know, where are the opportunities for you? Who are the audiences that you want to engage with? Always thinking back to your purpose again, you know, why is it important for you as an organization to engage with that group? And also, you know, what's meaningful about what you do for those audiences. So how do you meet the needs of the people that you want to engage with? And how, you know, where are you going to put information out, and what sort of information is most likely to engage them? So those are all the different things to start thinking about when you're mapping out your plan for where you want to get to. So in summary, an effective audience development plan will move you away from that case-by-case project-based culture. And I think particularly when it comes to funding, this is so important, because it means that you can identify funding opportunities that meet your needs rather than fitting your offer to fulfill the funder's requirements. And I think then it's much more sustainable, it's much more meaningful, and it means that what you put in place for you know, a funded activity will actually benefit more audiences in the long term. So there's a legacy to it as well. It's not just a sort of start and finish thing. And it links your purpose to, you know, the goals that you set in terms of who you want to engage with. Again, thinking about whether that's more of the same sort of people or entirely new audiences, or building those deeper relationships with your existing audiences. It uses evidence rather than assumption. So you can be really confident about the decisions that you're making, because, you know, they are informed by the data that you have. And it also, again, it means that you're not setting yourself up to fail from the start, because you've identified what the opportunities are, who are the people in your catchment area, for example. You're not aiming at an audience that you're never going to get, because you know they exist. You've looked at the evidence and you know that they're there, and you know what it is that they need and how you can meet those needs. And again, very importantly, it's a cross-organisation activity. So everybody understands, why you're targeting particular audiences, why it's important for you, what those audiences need, and what their role is in helping to support that engagement. Because I think, even in a relatively small team, and I know some of the museums that are here probably have very few full-time staff, for example. It might be one person who's responsible for a lot of these different areas of activity. You might also have a number of volunteers who contribute a lot to your organisation as well. But what can happen is that that development of your offer and the delivery of it can be quite fragmented, either across different sites or different teams or different individuals. And having a strategic plan really helps bring all of that together, and it helps you to take a sort of visitor view of the whole offer. So, for example, for some museums, their cafe is perhaps something that's put out to tender, so they don't operate it themselves. It's operated by somebody else, but the visitor doesn't know that. For them, it's just part of their visit experience. So making sure that if if any parts of your offer are actually operated separately from your organisation, making sure that they're also involved in this process, so that the standards that you expect from them and the type of experience that you expect for your visitors carries through regardless of who's actually responsible for delivering it. It means that you have a consistency, and that helps to build trust with your visitors as well. And also, very importantly, it plans for change over time, because you understand where it is you want to get to in the end. If you hit any bumps along the way, you can sort of negotiate around those. You can adapt your offer, you can adapt what you're doing, but you're still heading in the same direction at the end of it. And with all of that in place, it's much more likely to succeed. And as I say, it's very discouraging if you have things that you want to achieve and you never quite seem to get there, or you set yourself a target which was not going to be achievable from the start. So I think it's really important to always consider the evidence and what it tells you about what is actually possible. That being said, all of those things go into a development plan, but there is no sort of standard for what a plan might look like, because there's lots of different ways of formatting it, and lots of different ways of producing it. But the main thing is that it must work for you as an organisation. It must be a useful tool that helps you in your day-to-day work. So it's a practical thing. So in terms of what it actually looks like, there's really just two key questions to ask yourself. Is it useful to you? And does it enable you to track the impact of any changes or developments that you put in place? So that you can reflect on your progress against your different objectives. You can adjust things that aren't working quite in the way that you hoped they would. And you can also celebrate your success, which I think is so important for keeping everyone engaged and motivated in delivering a plan. And I think it's just human nature to sort of, you successfully deliver something and then you move on to the next thing without really pausing to reflect on how much you've achieved. And I think that's a really important part of the process. we're just coming up to a sort of short break time now, but I just wondered if anyone had any questions or comments or thoughts at this point before we go into the break.
Just wondered what you might think of it as a long-term goal, because we're in a very quite a small museum. Oh, is it? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can now. Sorry, Miranda, you were a little bit ruffled at the beginning, but I can
right.
hear you clearly now.
Long-term goals are quite tricky in our museum because there's only 2 people who are paid, and we do a lot of different types of work, you know, and long-term goals are quite difficult for us to sort of project forward, because we might not stay in the role for more than a year, and then there might be a lapse when someone else comes who perhaps doesn't have the same skills. It might be a volunteer that takes the role, or so our plans are usually sometimes quite perhaps to the next year, you know. It's
Sure, and I mean, I think
they're not 5 terms, 10-year plans, you know.
No, and I mean that will differ by organisation. So really, it's a matter of what is most useful to you. And I think, you know, a sort of a year-on-year development plan is, you know, that's perfectly fine. That's, you know, if that's going to work for you. I think the long-term stuff is really more about the organisation as a whole. So the museum itself, because that's the thing that doesn't change, and that's why, you know, having that purpose sort of set out and articulated is so important, because it means that new people coming in, there's, you know, that's something that they can take on and understand, and then there's the sort of continuity then. So it sort of plans for that change over time, which I think is so important. It gives you that sort of consistency about, okay, we are, you know, this is what we are here to do. It doesn't matter who's actually delivering it, but we as an organisation, these are our values, this is our purpose. And, you know, the way that you do that might change, and the people doing it might change, but ultimately you have the same sort of purpose, which is what helps hold it all together. Does that help at all? So, I mean, if I was to give a concrete example, it could be that, you know, Eden Valley Museum, as its long-term aim, you know, wants to engage with its local communities in a meaningful way. For example, that's, you know, you probably want to put a bit more work into it, but that's a sort of long-term thing that you're aiming at. Year on year, that might be, you know, we're going to co-create an exhibition this year with this group of people, for example, and that might be something that you're going to achieve within a year. Or you might, you know, a certain percentage of your visitors will be from within a particular catchment area, for example, and those are sort of shorter term development aims, but is something that you might achieve within a year. And then the next year you might look at something, you know, a different way of expanding or developing your audience. But it all comes back to the same principles. Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is why it's often the hardest thing to do, because, you know, it's sort of establishing the way forward. But once you've done that, everything else becomes a lot more straightforward. Any other thoughts or comments?
Hello, it's Charlotte here. Just wondering, so trying to work out our starting point, how much time do you think it would take to actually pull all that information together? Because we've got, you know, we've got a physical visitor book, we've got digi-tickets, we've got feedback forms, we've got loads of different things. You know, no one has time to do all this. That's, yeah.
Yeah, it is an investment in time, absolutely, and in a way that it can be a way of sort of defining what information you collect going forward. So we do have a tool, and I can send this to Stephen and Sarah for sending around with the slide set, which
Yeah.
is a data audit form which helps you to sort of note down all the different data sources that you have, but also think about how you use them. So, you know, you might be collecting information in a visitor book, for example, but does anyone ever have the time to actually look at it and act on it? And
No.
if they don't, why do you have it?
Yes. Yeah.
Which I think is a really good discipline, because it means that you will only ever collect the data that you will have the time to use and that is actually going to be useful to you. So I think it's, you know, it's worth putting in however long it takes really to identify which data sources you have a think about how useful they are, and then look in more detail at the ones that are useful, and stop collecting the rest.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. The audit form sounds great though, yeah, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, yeah, I'll send that through. It's a way of capturing the data that you know you have, and how you use it, how robust you think it is, but also helps you to identify what might be missing and think about, you know, what you might do to collect the really useful stuff. So yeah, I'll make sure that's sent through with you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte. Okay, well, if we don't have any more questions at this point, we can go into a quick comfort break now. Let's get underway. So I hope everyone had a nice break. And what we're going to be looking at in this next section is thinking about your offer and how you talk about it, and how that can make a really big difference to the sorts of people who might engage with you, or you know, might find your offer of interest to them. And to help us with that, because I think one of the things that's quite challenging, particularly for those of us who've worked in the sector for quite a long time, and particularly, you know, if you've worked with the same museum and museum collection for a long time, it's quite difficult to start thinking about what that might look like for someone who hasn't visited before, who perhaps isn't, you know, a frequent museum visitor or hasn't visited you. So, as Stephen said, we're going to go into breakout groups to think about this in a bit more detail. And this is what I'd like you to think about. So, and I've put this question in the chat so you can see it once you go into your groups as well. So think about the last time you did something that was new to you, whether it's visiting somewhere new or doing a new type of activity. And I know with COVID, that might have been quite a long time ago now. We've been a bit more restricted on the new things that we can do for a while. But think about, you know, what sort of activity it was. Think about how you felt at the time. Was there anything that made it, you know, more encouraging and, you know, made you feel perhaps a bit more welcome or more confident? And was there anything about it that was particularly challenging? So those are the sorts of things I'd like you to talk about in your groups. And then when we come back, we'll share some of those experiences. And what I would like you to do is to nominate one person in your group to feedback when we come back as a group. So you'll have about 10 minutes to talk this through in your groups, and then we'll come back and have another sort of 10 minutes or so of sharing. Is that clear for everyone? Can everyone see the question in the chat? So that when you disappear, you'll still be able to see it. Brilliant. Okay, well, I'll ask Stephen to open the doors then to the breakout rooms.
got a couple of late, I think, late breakers.
Yes, possibly. Well, we can see the groups they need to head to, and they.
Yeah, it's just Hannah and Jason now. So
yes, yeah, that's good. Excellent.
Yeah, sorry about we had a rather large number of no shows today. So.
Well, it could have been the extended.
Now, do you want? It's probably no point recording, right? Because it's just us. So I'm going to stop it.
Excellent. I see everyone coming back. How did you find that? Would somebody from, or let's say group 2, like to feedback?
Who's in which group? I don't remember. Do you know?
Oh, Stephen, have you still got it open to say?
Yeah, I can work out. So Kezia, you're in room 2 with Laura and Phil, the Williams.
Okay, so I was going to feedback for us. And basically I was discussing, I'm really new to the sector. So at first I was like, I'm not sure if I have anything. I've only worked at Towner since August. But because my role is new, I'm the marketing and communications assistant, and previously it was just a head of marketing and a head of press. So they didn't have time to do a lot of things that maybe they should have been doing. So that means I've now got time to start putting alt text on all of our social media posts. So I was talking about how that's like a new thing that we've just started. And I also wasn't sure about it initially because I don't think that Towner has done the research to kind of like prove how useful it is to our audience specifically, even though I do think it is useful. So I wasn't sure at first if it might come across like just a virtue signal or something like that. And I also did find it challenging because it's something that it's not worth doing if you don't do it right, kind of thing. So a lot of work does have to go into it, and it is very time consuming. But I think now that it's sort of, I've done the research and I've made like a set of guidelines for us to do it going forward, I think it now feels like, you know, second nature, like something that should have been there all along. So that's me feeling more comfortable now.
Great, thank you. There was a really interesting take on the question actually, because I was anticipating people thinking about things they'd done personally, but it's interesting that thinking about things that you've done new professionally, and I think that's something that will be familiar to a lot of people post-COVID, particularly where, you know, people have been engaging in new types of activity. So that's really interesting. Thank you.
No worries.
Any feedback from group 3? Does anyone remember being in room 3?
Yeah, I was in group 3, but Becky, and I had Catherine and Joe in my group as well. I've been bugsied to talk from. So mine kind of relates to something personal, but also work related. So basically during lockdown, outside of the museum sector, I also teach singing in musical theatre. And I really thought our kids are going to suffer not being able to do what they love. So I'd love to set them up projects of things they could do from their homes. And basically I got them to film themselves. We chose a song, film themselves, and then I would video edit it all together to make us look like we're all performing together. I'd never done video editing before, so I had to teach myself how to do it. I'd seen other people do it on YouTube and stuff. So, but yeah, it was a bit scary because it was like, oh God, I need to get this right. And yeah, it was a really positive from the kids. They really loved what we were doing, so we continued that all the way through to the beginning of this year. And I thought, oh, actually, I'm not too bad at this. The audience, we're getting really good feedback from people. And at going into the museum, we really started to improve on our digital presence. So we've got a new website. We're looking at different ways of engaging with our customers via a digital platform. So because I've obviously thought, oh, I'm quite good at doing video editing now, maybe implement this into my job role. So my line manager created my new job role to include being able to create video content for the museum, and it's had a really positive impact. We've had more people engage with our video content, and I found something that I actually enjoy. It's scary. I think that's probably the most challenging thing, is putting myself out there and teaching myself. But yeah, I think we've had a really positive feedback from it all. And I think Catherine's was similar. She was saying about how she was doing art classes, and it's something that she wasn't so confident about. So it's that's something new for me over the last year, really. And I'm still learning stuff now, and how to make things still look even better than I could do. So it's a learning game.
Thank you, that's really great. And from group 1.
That's just to remind you, that's the group with Charlotte, Miranda, and Hannah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
We were talking, or Charlotte brought up the business of going to a museum and actually being quite stressed out when you're with the family. Getting there was awkward, and I think one member of the family was in a wheelchair and it was a bit tricky. So I think to work on making an enjoyable experience for families, making it less stressful, you know, and that's obviously quite important. It is, after all, a day of entertainment, isn't it? The other thing I brought up is I've been to some museums where I've been so absorbed with what's been written on the walls, and it's all been so interesting. I haven't needed lots of activities anyway. I mean, I haven't gone to look for them. I've just enjoyed, you know, all the objects and everything there. So also people want to come away with some facts. They want to tell someone else about something, you know, they want to come away with something. So I think the content's really important to work on. And also we talked about museums being very child friendly, and I mentioned about the Museum of Childhood, which is like children running around, you know, all the time, you know, the parents in the cafe watching them, you know how if you've been there, you'll realize what the setup is. So making a museum very child friendly is a nice thing to do, and you can do that through Kids in Museums. You know, they've given us lots of advice about how to achieve that. Just making them welcome to families, because they're a big audience, you know. So
absolutely, yes, yeah.
And that was about it, I think. Making a museum accessible to disabled people. I mean, that's really difficult where we are, because we have a very old building and there's no lift. So you know, we must try more to bring more things downstairs, I think, and that's sort of ongoing problem.
Sure. No, that's great. Thank you very much. I think some key things emerging there around what might give you confidence, and some sort of reassurance as well. I think that kind of, you know, thinking about how stressful it might be. I think, you know, picking up on that point, Miranda, about people visiting with families, one of the things that we sort of recognise in particularly the lower engaged groups is that not only is there a sort of barrier in not knowing what to expect from the offer, because they're not regular museum goers, so, you know, they're not quite sure what the experience will be like, but also what might be expected of them. So as you say, you know, some museums create a very obviously family friendly welcome and kids are running about, and that's, you know, everyone feels very comfortable with that. Whereas, you know, for some families who haven't visited the museum before, they might think, you know, if my kids are running about and being noisy, am I going to feel embarrassed? Am I going to be asked to leave? And that can be a huge barrier. And I think we've all felt that, perhaps if we're somewhere where we've not been before and we're not quite sure, you know, am I wearing the right things? You know, is there something I need to know that I don't know? So I think it's, you know, when you think about what your offer looks like to your audiences, these are really important things to think about. Think, you know, who are you inviting in? You know, who is it that you're asking to come and engage with you, and what are you asking them to do, and how you can sort of shape that into a plan. So part of your planning is thinking about what your offer looks like to your audiences. And people who are familiar with sort of marketing practice will recognize this idea of features and benefits. But I think even outside of marketing, it's a useful way to think about, you know, what we present through the museum, and, you know, what people are going to get out of it. And, you know, time and time again, I see in messaging about particularly museums that are perhaps in historic context, so in, you know, older buildings, or, you know, part of a wider offer, is a description of the history of that building, which, you know, can be very interesting, and sort of facts about it, and, you know, the number of things that are in the collection, and then, you know, things like opening hours and where you are, you know, which are all very important bits of information. But the thing that's missing is that idea of what the experience will be like. So when I visit, will it be relaxing? Will I learn something? Is it fun? You know, is it a sort of quiet space where I can escape from everyday life? So when you're thinking about your different audiences, different people are going to respond to different types of messaging within that. And your higher engaged audiences are more likely to respond to those features than lower engaged groups, because people who aren't familiar with what that might mean, it, you know, it won't mean anything to them that it's a, you know, it's a particular period building, and really sort of talking to them about, you know, what's in it for them from a visit is much more likely to help them make the decision to come and try you out and see what's what. So in your messaging, always think about, you know, what does that make your offer look like to the people that you're trying to attract. And when you're making that invitation, you know, I think thinking about the language you use and the images you use and things like that are really important. So what I'd like to do now is just take a bit of time to look at this piece of marketing copy for the River House Museum. So this is something that might appear on a website or on a flyer or something like that. Think about the language that's used in it, the information that's being given. Spend a couple of minutes reading it through. And then I'd like your thoughts on what sort of audience you think that piece of information is likely to attract. And also, are there people that it won't appeal to? And what else might you say about a visit to this museum that you think might appeal to those people who this messaging is perhaps not quite right for them? So when anybody's ready to sort of share any thoughts on that.
My first initial thoughts is, as it's a free public museum, low-income families would definitely be attracted to that because there's something free for them to do on a day out together.
Do you think the information in there is does it give them what they need to make the decision to visit?
I think it being in the first line free is really inviting. That would be the first thing that would appeal to me. And the fact that it's got gardens, so it means if they do have young children, they can go running around. Might need to be a bit careful as there's rivers, so you don't want them falling in. But
Sure.
And they've got loads of different activities that could be more diverse for the younger children, and education is one of their prime things, and exploring the garden. So yeah, I would definitely, if I had children, young children, and looking for a cheap free day out, then that'd be where I'd go.
It doesn't tell you what is in the museum, what the museum's actually about. That's the only thing I noticed.
No, as a mum of 3 young children, I wouldn't immediately think this is a family friendly venue that I must go to. Like, it's great that it's free, but if I was making a decision about what to do with my children, this to me doesn't sound, I don't know, I wouldn't immediately think, oh, they'd definitely be welcome there.
I agree, I was saying.
Yeah, I'd start with, like Becky, saw the free in the gardens and thought that was great for families. And then what sort of put me off was things like Baroque Octagon Gallery, exhibitions. It sounded like the actual, what was there sounded like it would appeal more to the adult audience, And it was interesting because I hadn't thought of this before, but also the fact that it was mentioning other highlights being shop and cafe suggested to enjoy it, you needed money to spend to actually get the most out of being there.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was, but again, it does mention free at the end. So I think, yeah, so that's, I was sort of wavering between the two.
I do actually think it sounds like a lovely place to go, but I would think it'd be a lovely place to go if I wanted to go somewhere like a bit quiet, for a bit of peace.
Yes, exactly.
Which is why I wouldn't jump there with my kids.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so there's perhaps a bit of mixed messaging going on here.
Yeah.
So what sort of things do you think, if you were trying to appeal to a family audience, what other things do you think you could include in it that might make it more appealing?
We make a point of saying that we are family friendly, so literally spelling it out. Yeah, welcome visitors of all ages, that sort of thing, and making a note about, that we're interactive. We've got interactive activities for children.
Maybe specifying the events as well. So what are the live events that are taking place? Are they, children's activities, or are they concerts or theatre, or what actually are they? What's the programming?
Yeah, it's a bit vague, isn't it, about what you might expect when you go.
And the education is interesting, because what do they mean by education? I first thought schools, but it doesn't actually say, what it is. Not that you'd necessarily want it at that stage. You might want it somewhere else on the website, where you go to a page which specifies exactly what the education programme is.
Absolutely. And I think, all of these are really good points, and it just sort of, if you think about what you're writing and how people are going to receive it, people who aren't familiar with what you do, it really helps you to start thinking about how you target different types of messaging at different audiences, even though your offer is the same, your permanent offer, your building, and perhaps your permanent exhibition and so on, or your collection displays. They're unlikely to change, but the way you talk about them can make a big difference to how comfortable people feel about trying you out for the first time, or whether more confident museum visitors, they will probably want to know more about exactly what it is that they can see and do while they're there. So I mean, things like, I mean, pointing out the fact that, you know, the other parts of the offer, you know, there are paid for elements. So there's a shop and a cafe, but, you know, it says that there are gardens. It doesn't tell you that you could perhaps bring a picnic, for example, which might be more attractive to families who want to bring their own food. So lots of different things to think about. And I think it's particularly when you're short of time, which, you know, many museum teams are, and, you know, you're doing lots of different jobs within the museum, it can feel like it takes too long to come up with a different sort of set of words for different types of marketing activity, for example. So you know, the easiest thing to do is to set on something that you feel happy with and just put it across all your different channels and platforms. But this, you know, as you've already pointed out, this doesn't really give anybody the information that all of the information that they need. So it doesn't quite meet anybody's needs. And although it might be something that you would put on a website, you wouldn't necessarily use the same sort of language in print or through social media channels, for example. So really thinking about the context of where you're putting your messaging out and who you're aiming at is a really key part of helping people to make the decision to visit you. And as Miranda was saying, you know, making things as simple and stress-free as possible, that's the way to get people to make the decision. You know, make it easy for them, take the guesswork out of it. And that is, you know, again, a big part of your strategic planning. And thinking about, you know, what you're offering and how you're going to talk about it. So within your engagement strategies, the different things that you need to be sort of paying attention to are making a targeted approach for the different audiences that you're aimed at, and that could be through your marketing, it could be through your programming, it might be around your the sort of offer in terms of, you know, what you have in a cafe, or can people bring their own food, or, you know, different price ranges within a shop, for example. So you're accounting for everybody's different needs. And also thinking about going back to those sort of balancing the different priorities that you might have. If you've got sort of professional ambitions around, you know, how you want to present the collections and perhaps being, you know, more challenging in the way that things are displayed. Also thinking about who that might engage, but who it might be a barrier for and what you could do about that. So again, thinking right back to what we were talking about at the beginning in terms of your audience development can be about new audiences, but it can be about your existing audiences as well, and it's likely to be both. Making sure that you balance out, you know, any changes that you're making with what it is about your offer that your current audiences really love and appreciate, so that you're not sort of alienating them, you're taking them on the journey with you. And, you know, thinking about it in the round, as I say, so it's not just about the marketing, it is about the offer itself as well, and what the experience is like for people when they visit. And there are lots of different tools available that can help you with this. And we'll have a look at a few of these now. Now, many of you are probably familiar with SWOT analyses. I'm sure lots of you have done these in lots of different contexts, but they can be really useful as a way of thinking about, you know, what is it about you internally that you can use to your advantage, so your strengths, what's going to appeal to people, where your internal weaknesses are. So that might be, particularly, I think, during the pandemic, people have noted that, you know, their digital skills were perhaps not what they needed when sort of pivoting to online delivery was necessary. So, you know, thinking about sort of upskilling and things like that. And then externally, what's going on that might impact on your ability to deliver, whether there are new opportunities opening up, or whether, you know, there are threats on the horizon. And there's also PEST, which some people use. This is an entirely external view, thinking about all the different external impacts on your organization. So that's things like, you know, government interventions or changes in policy, change with sort of economic factors post-COVID have become extremely important, because there have been some dramatic changes to the disposable income of some groups, some of whom were, you know, core museum attenders. So, you know, understanding the sort of economic impacts of COVID, I think, is really important for your audience development going forward. And that's something we'll look at in the next session when we look at segmentation particularly. You know, you might be in an area with a growth in unemployment, for example. A large employer might have gone under, and that, you know, that can have a dramatic impact on a, you know, particular community. Social factors, changing demographics, changing behaviours and attitudes. That's, you know, that can be important. Technological, again, thinking about all the new tools that were developed during the pandemic. Suddenly we all became experts at using Zoom. You know, I for one had never really heard of or used Zoom 2 years ago, and now, you know, we use it all the time and it becomes part of our everyday life. So these are all things that can impact on how you develop your offer, and these are all things that also impact on your audiences. So, you know, thinking about the potential, how that might impact on your strategic planning is, you know, it can be a useful exercise to go through. But something that I find particularly useful is SAW, which is less familiar than SWOT, but it takes a more sort of strategic approach to that kind of planning. I mean, it takes your strengths and opportunities and it puts them in a more strategic context. So bringing in your ambition and the results of achieving that ambition. So in terms of ambition, again, this is internal. So it's what is it that you want to achieve as an organization, and it can be things like, you know, accreditation in different areas. It could be, for example, using Miranda's example of kids in museums, you know, being accredited as a family-friendly museum. And the results of that, the sort of external results, would be that, you know, your local families might feel more confident about visiting, and so you'd have that impact on them. They'd have more opportunities in their area to engage with you. So that again is a really useful team exercise to sort of bring your staff and your volunteers together to think about your strengths and opportunities, what you want to achieve, and what the results of that would look like in the wider society, wider context. So and I think the other thing about this is you can do it at a sort of overall level, or it could be that you want to look at a particular service or area of your programming and look at that in more detail. So it could be your exhibition program, for example, or your education program. You can apply it at lots of different levels. So it's quite a useful way of starting to think about things in that strategic way. And the other tool, which is particularly useful, I don't know if anyone's already familiar with this, is a thing called the Ansoff matrix. And this was developed as a marketing tool, which is, you know, those names that are in grey in those different quadrants. They are the sort of marketing terms. I've actually renamed them because I don't come from a marketing background, and I found those names a bit off-putting. So I just renamed them with things that felt more natural and familiar to me. And I think that's an important thing about all of these tools is that you use them in the way that's most useful to you. So if they're not useful, don't use them, or adapt them in a way that's more meaningful for you and helpful for identifying your strategies. And I think, you know, if we're thinking right back to our first conversation when we were looking at the sampler, what we saw was that although as a group you probably have quite a lot in common, you know, you all work in the same sector, you may have similar experiences, there's also a lot of difference amongst you as well in terms of how you see things and what sparks your interest and what sort of questions you might ask of you know, when you're looking at different objects, for example. And thinking about how you're going to meet the needs of all those different types of audiences, what you're going to do for different groups of people, you know, what, you know, who's going to be responsible for doing all of that. It can be really daunting because that's a lot of information to juggle with. And I think the Ansoff matrix is really useful in starting to break that down into more sort of manageable chunks. So essentially, you've got two axes. One is focused on your audiences, from your existing audiences to new audiences. And then along the bottom, it's looking at your offer and your programming. So again, from what you already do to perhaps, you know, things that you might develop within your offer. And in this bottom left quadrant, which I've termed where the love is, this is your market penetration in marketing terms. And this is what you know works really well and is enjoyed by your current audiences. Really, this is where you can start to think about developing loyalty through perhaps membership schemes or volunteering, deepening those relationships. Thinking about secondary spend, if you have a shop and cafe, encouraging repeat visits from people who are already visiting, and sort of thinking about increasing footfall to some extent as well. And then the top left section is audience, is your market development, and this is around making friends. So this is all new people who aren't engaging with you at the moment, but it's taking your existing offer. So you're not changing anything about what you do, but you are introducing it to new audiences, inviting new people to engage with you. So this might be about just presenting it in different ways, using different channels or different messaging. It might be about taking it out to where people are. So sort of taking sort of tasters out to perhaps shopping centres or, you know, libraries or somewhere else where you might be able to reach the people who aren't coming through your door at the moment. Reaching out to new areas and presenting your offer in a way that might appeal to a different type of visitor. And along the bottom right is about taking your existing audiences on a bit of a journey with you and inviting them to do new and different things with you. So it might be about if your offer is spread across different sites, for example. I know with a lot of local authority museums, they might have multiple sites in the same area, and you might have people who are loyal visitors to one but never visit the others. So it might be about encouraging them to engage with more of your offer. Or it might be that they come to your sort of permanent displays, you know, they're regular visitors to your museum, but they don't come to events. So you're thinking about how you might encourage them to do that. And then the last one is sort of where there's a lot of need for resource in terms of time and probably money as well, because this is all the unknowns. It's new audiences that you don't engage with, and it's new activities that you haven't done before. So in marketing terms, that's diversification, and I call it the experimental zone. And it's an ideal place where you might have attracted some funding to try something new, for example. Again, the funding should be identified and aligned with your strategic goals. So if you do, if you do develop something in this experimental zone which is successful, you can then build it into your business as usual and your overall strategic planning. And it can be where you have an opportunity to involve audiences in more of the decision making, for example, and taking a really audience-centered approach to your development with co-created content, perhaps commissioning new pieces of work, perhaps venturing into a new area of collecting, for example. And again, post-COVID, a number of museums have thought about how to start collecting sort of contemporary experiences and how people responded to COVID, for example. So that would be a sort of activity that would fit into that quadrant there. And again, it's something that's useful as a whole team exercise. And here it is sort of populated with some of the things you might think about in those different areas. So as I say, the audience penetration, the love quadrant is about building advocacy and perhaps having special events, developing membership schemes, things like that. Audience development is around the sort of new messaging, different channels to reach people, and perhaps having those sampling activities that take place somewhere else other than the museum site. In your offer development, that deepening relationships with your existing audiences. This is something where you might have other people come in and interpret your collections, for example. You might have guest curators who present things in a slightly different way to appeal to those visitors who perhaps are engaging with the ongoing offer but aren't coming to temporary exhibitions or events. So having sort of new partners to work with on those types of activity can help bring new voices into the museum. And then that experiment zone, the diversification, those funded opportunities or co-creation activities where it takes a longer time and quite a lot, and can take resource in terms of money as well to develop those things. So and I think the key thing is when you're thinking about your strategic planning is to make sure there's a balance across all of those things. If you feel like you're always in the top right quadrant, for example, it's always going to be very challenging for you because things are constantly changing and there's never anything, nothing is ever sort of embedded. And things can cross over from one quadrant to another as well. So, what is part of your offer development might also lead into your audience development as well, because those new types of offer might also appeal to new audiences. So does anyone have any thoughts at this point on perhaps how you might grow the love for your museum? So how might you deepen the relationships with the people who already know and love you? Any thoughts on that? Or does anyone have any examples perhaps of activities they've done that would fit into one of these areas?
So just on sort of messaging really, so just really sort of, well, we don't do it ourselves, but it's something that we need to do, is really like pinpoint on you know, the group of people that always come to our half-term activities, we always are like inundated, and just making sure that we actually communicate directly just to them instead of just sending generic emails out to everybody in our database, which, you know, we need to be much more targeted and actually just talk to them and make them feel special. But it's just time.
Sure. Yes, and that is exactly what I was going to say. It's always, you know, you might have the it's kind of every time you send the e-newsletter out, for example, you're probably thinking, oh, you know, I wish we had time to do something slightly different, something slightly more tailored. You never quite get the time. And I think that's where a strategic plan can really help, because you can plan for that time to allow yourself to develop things when you need to.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a great example. Any other thoughts on how you might use? Does this seem like it might be a useful tool for you to start breaking down what you're going to be doing for different types of audience?
Yeah, one thing, what you were saying at the top right-hand corner, about you can sometimes feel you're trapped in it. Well, that sort of feels a bit familiar, that if you're constantly doing things to try and improve things, you might be just out on the limb there a bit, and you haven't really looked at the bottom left-hand corner enough, or you know, you haven't really got a strategy.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I was going to say something similar. I think this is going to be helpful in terms of ensuring we get that balance right. Because it's very easy, as Phil was saying, to go chasing the money or the funding, because you need that for development. Whereas actually, you know, we need to spend time on looking, even if it's, you know, just on the messaging and the marketing and communications. That could be a, you know, it takes time, but a potential way of developing our audience base, or the range of our audiences.
Absolutely. And I think it's, you know, it can often be tempting to think that, you know, you need to change everything you do, or you need to do something entirely new to appeal to new audiences, where it could just be that you just need to present it slightly differently. And then you can, you know, perhaps move away from that top right corner, which can be quite a scary place to be, and also quite an expensive place to be as well. So yes, I completely understand that feeling. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, so I don't know if this is a good example or not, but something that we do to sort of like communicate with our people, well, audiences that have visited us, but also try and attract new people, is we sort of send out monthly requests for reviews to people who have visited for TripAdvisor, but leave them the option of, like, if they haven't had a good time, to get in touch with us directly rather than leave the public review. And it's been really useful, because it's helped up our reviews, which then helps new visitors to sort of, you know, see what we've got to offer, and gives them a good impression. And those people that actually have had comments have all been really constructive, and it's sort of opened up that dialogue with them. So, you know, they might have gone away thinking, oh, they could have done that and that better, but because we've given them the opportunity to have their say, we've sort of opened that dialogue, and they understand a little bit more about, first of all, why we might not have some things in place that they think should be in place, but also they feel listened to, because we can't please everybody, and we can't take, you know, we've had some amazing suggestions, we can't do them all, but it helps our visitors feel listened to. So it's been quite nice in that, yeah, to see that sort of develop.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, and it's also a really good example of, you know, using what you have available to you in the most kind of constructive way. So, you know, taking charge of TripAdvisor is something that, you know, we talk about quite a bit, in terms of, you know, making sure you know, even if it's not in that invited way that you do, even just making sure you've got your management protocols within TripAdvisor set up so that you can respond to comments that are being made, and because and that response can be public and people can see that you are actually listening to what's being fed back to you. I think that's really important as well. You're not a passive partner in things like TripAdvisor and social media. It is part of having a conversation with people, and again, it's something that takes time, but if it's kind of built into a regular process in the way that you've described, Laura, I think that's a great way of dealing with it and planning it in. Fantastic. Okay, thank you so much for sharing those. I'm aware that we're coming to time now, so I just wanted to have a very quick look at what's coming up in the next session for those of you who are able to join it. So we will be looking at segmentation as a tool. Because it's such a useful tool, it's worth spending a little bit more time on, which is why we've dedicated a whole session to it. We'll be looking at, the sort of, again, the principles of segmentation and how it can be used. We'll largely be focusing on audience spectrum, because it is a tool that has been developed specifically to look at arts and cultural engagement, which is why it's so useful in this context. And so we'll be looking at the different segments and how they might be relevant to you and how you can use the segmentation in your strategic planning. And we'll also look at how your audiences are likely to have changed, and the sort of short-term and long-term impacts of the pandemic and what you might need to consider in your planning, in your strategic planning. Again, for those of you who won't be able to attend, it will be recorded. So my understanding is, Stephen, that will be available to even for people who haven't attended the session. And then finally, we have some links to other information that you might find useful. So there's a whole batch of things to look at, thinking about audience development, and also a bit about audience spectrum in advance of the next session, and for those of you who won't be able to come along to that. And then there's some case studies and data which looks specifically at the impacts of the pandemic as well that you might find useful.